Hello, everyone. So, in this lecture, we will talk about the principles of metabolic pathways. But first, before we start to understand the principles, we need to know that what exactly the metabolic pathways are and what are the different uh, reaction pathways that comprise of the metabolism. So, the metabolic pathways are a series of consecutive enzymatic reactions that produce specific products. In order to understand this, let me give you an example of a pathway where the initial substrate is A and the final product is D. Now, because I have termed this as a pathway, this means that it might be having different consecutive reactions in the series. So let's say that this A is getting converted into B, B to C, C to finally D. So this is what indicates a pathway. So this pathway here in the example is a 3 reaction pathway with 3 different enzymes acting on these 3 reactions. So these 3 enzymes are the E1, which is converting A to B, E2 converting B to C, and E3 C to D. So this is what a pathway looks like. Now, the pathway that I have drawn on the screen is a chain kind of pathway, which means that it is happening in a linear form. And the example of a chain kind of metabolic pathway includes glycolysis. On the other hand side, if we talk about the other type of pathway, it is the cyclic form. So let me give you an example. So let's say A gets converted into B, B into C, C into D, and D gets converted back into A. So this type of a metabolic reaction pathway is known as a cyclic pathway. And the example involves Krebs cycle. So this is what a metabolic pathway is. Now let's move forward to understand that what are the different reaction pathways that comprise the metabolism. So basically these reaction pathways have been divided into 2 types, catabolism and anabolism. Catabolism is basically the reaction type which involves degradation of the molecules. So let's say there is a bigger molecule and it is acted upon by catabolic enzymes, and this bigger molecule is converted into simpler products. And in the course of catabolic reactions, free energy is released in the form of different high energy molecules like ATP and NADPH. And these high energy molecules are used by the cell for performing different types of other reactions. On the other hand side, anabolism is the type of reaction where simpler molecules are converted into bigger molecules. So these involve biosynthesis, right? Okay, now let's move on towards understanding the different metabolic pathway principles. So first, the first principle is that metabolic pathways are irreversible. So to understand this, I will tell you that at least one reaction of the pathway is having a very high negative delta G value. Now, what is delta G? It is basically the free energy, right? So if I talk about the pathways, most of the reactions in the pathway, they are having a delta G near 0, which means that those reactions are at equilibrium. But at least one or some of the reactions of a pathway are having very high negative delta G value, which means that these reactions are exergonic in nature. Now, because these are exergonic in nature and they have a high negative delta G value, this means that the reactants, they have more free energy than the products, right? And this means that due to this highly exergonic nature and the high negative delta G value, these reactions are going to confer directionality to the pathway, right? So if we talk thermodynamically, the irreversible reactions, for example, in case of glycolysis, there are 3 reactions which are irreversible, the reaction number 1, number 3, and number 10. So these 3 reactions are irreversible. So thermodynamically, the irreversible reactions, they are responsible for driving the metabolic pathway in the forward direction. If these reactions were not irreversible, the pathway's movement towards completion would have got affected. The pathway would have got stuck in between. The final product would not have been formed if there were no irreversible reactions, if these reactions were not having high negative delta G value. So in order to make sure that the pathway is proceeding towards completion, the irreversible reactions are important because they confer directionality to the pathway. So that was the first principle. Now let's see the next principle, that is the catabolic and the anabolic pathways must differ from each other, which means that if there is a substrate A which gets converted into product B, the pathway that is being followed for the conversion of A to B should be different from the pathway that is followed for the conversion of B back into A, right? So both the pathways should be different. And why is it so? So that there is an independent control of the two processes. The catabolic and the anabolic processes of one compound should be having different control, independent control. Both the pathways should not be interfering with each other. This is to ensure that all the cells, all the molecules in the cell are being formed and degraded at different rates according to the need of the cell. For example, there are two metabolites, metabolite 1 and metabolite 2. So this metabolite 1, if metabolite 2 is required by the cell, it is very necessary that the cell is turning off the pathway for the conversion of 2 back into A. As in this figure, you can see that there are two different pathways being followed for the interconversion of 1 to 2. For the conversion of metabolite 1 into 2, the pathway that is being followed is this one. And for the conversion of metabolite 2 into 1, the pathway that is being followed is this one, right? So there are two different processes happening for the interconversion. So at one particular movement, if the metabolite 2 is required by the cell, it is very necessary that the cell is turning off the pathway of conversion of 2 into 1, so that only this pathway of conversion of 1 into 2 is on at that moment, so that this specific metabolite 2 can be accumulated in the cell for the use in the cell, right? So such independent control is very important, and it would have been very difficult if these two pathways were not different from each other. Now let's move to the next one, that is that every metabolic pathway has a first committed step. Now, what is the meaning of a committed step? So committed step is basically the step of a pathway which, if happens, the pathway has the tendency to move towards the end of the pathway. Now let's understand this with the help of glycolysis only, right? So in case of glycolysis, the committed step is the third reaction catalyzed by phosphofructokinase. So as I told you that the committed step is the one which after which the substrate has only one way to go, that is, it has to proceed through the pathway towards the end, and this reaction is highly controlled. Usually, the committed step of a pathway is the first irreversible step of the pathway. Now, in case of glycolysis, the third reaction is the irreversible step, and this is the committed step also. Now, many of you might be thinking that why first reaction, that is catalyzed by hexokinase, is not the committed step, because it is also irreversible. So the reason is that after glucose is catalyzed by hexokinase to convert glucose 6-phosphate, this glucose 6-phosphate also has the tendency to move into other pathways like glycogenesis and pentose phosphate pathway, that is the HMP shunt. So this glucose 6-phosphate can enter into those pathways. So there is no surety of this glucose 6-phosphate to only move towards the glycolytic pathway. It can enter in other pathways as well. So that is why this reaction is not the committed step. Now moving on to the next irreversible step of glycolysis, which is the phosphofructokinase. Here what is happening? This phosphofructokinase is acting on the fructose 6-phosphate to convert it into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So after the phosphorylation of fructose 6-phosphate into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, there are only two fates of this molecule. Either it can proceed towards the glycolysis and complete it towards the end, or it can get converted back into fructose 6-phosphate, right? So if there is a need of glucose catabolism, if there is an energy need in the cell, and if this third reaction takes place in the glycolysis, the pathway will definitely move towards the completion. So that is why every metabolic pathway has a committed step to ensure that the pathway is completing towards the end. Now, let's move on to the next principle, which is that all the metabolic pathways are regulated. Now, metabolic pathways are regulated by the laws of supply and demand. What does that mean? It means that if the cell requires a specific molecule at a present moment, there will be certain activators inside the cell which are going to regulate the pathway in such a manner that the product is being formed in large amounts. Whereas if the molecule is not needed at a moment, then the pathway will be shut down. This is to ensure that the energy is not being overconsumed and the energy is rather being saved. And usually, the rate limiting step of the metabolic pathway is very critical for regulation. And this rate limiting step is nothing else but the committed step of the pathway. So, the regulation of the pathway is responsible for preventing the unnecessary synthesis of the metabolites which are not required by the cell, and also like to prevent the unnecessary synthesis of the metabolites and along the pathway because they are not required. They will be to ensure that no energy is being wasted but rather saved. So let's understand this with the help of glycolysis again. So in case of glycolysis, there are three different steps, which are the regulatory steps, the reaction number 1, 1, 3, and 10. So these reactions are the regulatory reactions, and the activators and the inhibitors are going to be acting upon these reactions to ensure that the energy is being not wasted. So for example, if there is a need of glucose inside the cell. So the glycolysis will be shut down by inhibiting these three enzymes at different levels. However, if there is an excessive need of energy inside the cell, so the glucose needs to be catalyzed. So in that case, these enzymes will be overactivated so that this pathway can proceed towards the end for the production of energy. So this is how the regulation takes place by, and there are several other mechanisms by which the regulation is happening inside the metabolic pathways. So the fourth principle means that all the metabolic pathways, they are regulated by different mechanisms to ensure that energy is not wasted and to ensure that there is a sophisticated mechanism for the regulation of energy in the cell. Now, talking about the last principle, that metabolic pathways in the eukaryotic cells, they occur in specific locations. So what does that mean? This means that there is compartmentation of the different metabolic pathways, that different metabolic pathways will be occurring in different organelles inside the cells. So this basically allows the pathways to operate in different locations effectively. For example, the ATP molecules, they are generated in the mitochondria, but they are mostly consumed in the cytoplasm. So, for example, if I talk about the mitochondria, there are different metabolic pathways that are taking place inside it, like the citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain, you can say the oxidative phosphorylation, the fatty acid oxidation. So, all these different kinds of metabolic pathways are happening inside the mitochondria. Whereas there are certain other metabolic pathways that are taking place inside the cytosol, glycolysis being one of them. Inside the lysosomes, there are other ones, nucleus, and all these stuff. So different organelles are having different kinds of metabolic pathways taking place. This is to ensure that the pathways are confined to specific locations. This is also known as sequestration. You might read this word as well. This is known as sequestration. This is to ensure that everything is happening efficiently. So these were the 5 metabolic pathway principles, which are integral for the functioning of the pathways in the living bodies. Thank you.